Hello everyone, my name is Daniela and I'm a volunteer with For a Safer Space. Today's video will be part 1 of a 2-part presentation on trauma. I would like to begin this presentation with a land acknowledgement. I am conducting this presentation on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island. While it is important to acknowledge which land I'm on, it is equally as important to understand why we engage in a land acknowledgement. First, acknowledging the land is an act of decolonization. Decolonization is an act that aims to reverse colonialism. It is also significant in understanding history and acknowledging history, as well as showing respect for indigenous peoples and their relationship to the land. However, it is important to not only use a land acknowledgement, but to educate ourselves on historical and current issues, stand with indigenous peoples in the pursuit of social justice, and decolonize our thoughts and actions. Next, I would like to provide a content warning. This presentation details trauma, topics of abuse, violence, and self-harming behaviors will be discussed briefly. Today's agenda will include a brief introduction, followed by what is trauma, types of trauma, examples of trauma, vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress, types of trauma responses, elements of trauma, signs of trauma, how does trauma impact the brain, how does trauma impact the body, trauma and mental health, post-traumatic stress disorder, and to conclude, resources and key takeaways will be discussed. Trauma is the emotional consequences that distressing events have on an individual. Experiences of trauma are very individualized. What one person finds traumatic, another person may not. As well, symptoms and reactions to trauma differ. Trauma can have long-lasting impacts on the brain and body. In fact, it can have direct impacts on mental health, including an evident relationship to post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. What is trauma? Trauma describes the emotional consequences that distressing events have on an individual. These events are more difficult to describe because one event can be more traumatic for some individuals than others for varying reasons. Traumatic events that are experienced earlier in someone's life, which can include abuse and neglect, can have negative impacts on someone. Similarly, events that occur in later life where someone has no control in the matter can result in trauma. When the memories and impacts of the traumatic event worsen, it can sometimes result in post-traumatic stress disorder, which can have serious impacts. More on this will be discussed in a later slide. Types of trauma. There are 3 main types of trauma. The first type is acute trauma. Acute trauma derives from one incident alone. Chronic trauma is another type of trauma that results from an event that is repeated or prolonged, such as abuse. Finally, complex trauma results from being subjected to different and multiple traumatic events. Examples of trauma. As discussed, what is important to understand is that trauma is different for every individual. What one person may find traumatic, another may not. With that said, some examples of where trauma can derive from include physical, sexual, verbal, or psychological abuse, bullying, intimate partner violence, community violence, traumatic grief, medical trauma, terrorism, refugee experiences, natural disasters, neglect, serious accidental injury, impaired caregiver, forced separation, war, trafficking, witnessing a suicide, and racism or other forms of discrimination. This can be called oppression trauma. Vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress. Both vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress are commonly used interchangeably due to the reason that they are both types of indirect trauma due to being exposed to distressing images or stories secondhand. However, there are differences between the two terms. Vicarious trauma is the trauma that some professionals develop through working with individuals who have traumatic lived experiences. For instance, someone who works in a domestic abuse shelter may develop vicarious trauma. Secondary traumatic stress was developed as a way to better conceptualize why service providers have similar symptoms to PTSD without experiencing the traumatic event directly. Both vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress can occur to individuals outside of trauma-exposed professions. Various individuals can also experience these due to being impacted by stories they are exposed to or through witnessing certain traumatic events. Types of trauma responses. There are 4 types of trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. The fight response occurs when it is thought that to survive an event, the individual needs to fight back. This response derives from the belief that to get what is wanted or needed in a situation, the individual needs to fight to ensure their safety and security, potentially due to experiences where this was not felt in the past. When this is shown in a healthy way, it leads to individuals setting boundaries and being assertive in protecting themselves. However, when this is an unhealthy coping mechanism, someone shows this response in a way that harms themselves or others. The flight response occurs when someone escapes or avoids. This derives from events where an individual wanted to avoid uncomfortable or unsafe feelings, conversations, or situations. This can be a healthy response when it is used to remove from situations that are not healthy, such as a bad relationship. However, this can be unhealthy when individuals exhibit the flight response through avoiding responsibilities or coping with substances. The freeze response is when someone stops and does not take any action, staying where they are. This can occur through being numb to feelings or needs. This can be healthy through mindfulness, where individuals remain present. In fact, mindfulness is a healthy practice that can help individuals stay present and appreciate the current moment. However, this becomes unhealthy through dissociation and detaching from the environment. Finally, the fawn response is people-pleasing behavior. This is shown healthily through compassion and caring for others through listening. However, this can be unhealthy when individuals ignore their own needs to focus on someone else's. This can sometimes lead to individuals remaining in abusive relationships, for instance. Elements of trauma. There are 3 different elements to trauma. The first element is event. This is when someone is a part of a situation that involves threat or harm. The second is experience, which is a person's perception of the event, specifically how they may view the event or how they are impacted. The final element is effect. This can occur immediately or later on, and the effects can be short or long term. Effects that may occur include difficulties coping with normal stressors, difficulties regulating behavior, or difficulties with cognitive processes such as memory, attention, or thinking. Signs of trauma. There are various signs of trauma, however, it is important to understand that there are varying ways that individuals will respond to trauma. There is no right or wrong reaction. Signs can be classified into 2 groups: emotional and psychological signs and physical signs. Emotional and psychological signs include shock, denial, or disbelief, confusion, difficulties concentrating, anger, irritability, or mood swings, anxiety or fear, guilt, shame, or self-blaming, withdrawing and isolating from others, feelings of sadness or hopelessness, feelings of numbness or disconnect. Physical signs include insomnia, nightmares, fatigue, easily startled, difficulties concentrating, racing heartbeat or heart palpitations, agitation, aches and pains, and muscle tension. How does trauma impact the brain? Trauma alters the brain in a variety of ways, such as decision-making or various subconscious responses to the environment. Trauma mainly impacts 3 regions of the brain: the amygdala, or the emotion center, the prefrontal cortex, which helps in emotional and impulse regulation, and the hippocampus, which controls memory. These regions all work together in managing stress. When reminded of traumatic experiences, the amygdala can become overactive, similarly to experiencing the event for the first time. The prefrontal cortex, however, is suppressed so that individuals are not able to control their emotions as well. The hippocampus has difficulties in differentiating the actual event with the memory. Therefore, the trigger is deemed as a threat. As a result, the brain stays in a place of hypervigilance, so that someone is in a constant cycle of strong emotional reactivity. How does trauma impact the body? When trauma occurs and remains unresolved, it can lead to various impacts on the body. The emotional and physical reactions that result from trauma can put someone more at risk for health conditions, such as heart attacks, strokes, diabetes, and cancer. As well, this risk can be increased based off of the number of traumatic events someone experienced. Trauma and mental health. Trauma can increase the risk of developing mental health disabilities. There is a direct relationship between trauma and PTSD, and traumatic experiences can also result in substance use or self-harm as a means to cope. Trauma can impact everyone differently. However, it can impact people's day-to-day life. For instance, trust may become more difficult, impacting relationships. It can also result in individuals finding themselves no longer enjoying things they once loved. As well, some might find it difficult to manage their emotions, leading to reactions that appear to be excessive, but this is due to the mind reacting to a memory that is traumatic, not the current environment. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a mental health disability that results from a traumatic event through experiencing or witnessing it. Symptoms commonly experienced include flashbacks, nightmares, anxiety, and uncontrollable thoughts about the event. The majority of people who experience traumatic events may find it difficult momentarily. However, with time and self-care, they find that they can better cope with the experience. But when symptoms worsen or last for long periods of time, impacting daily functioning, it can be a sign of PTSD. It is important to understand that while there is a direct relationship, the majority of those who experience traumatic events do not develop PTSD. Now we'll go over resources. The most important thing to take away from this video is that there is supports and help available. For an immediate mental health crisis, reach out to a crisis line for support. For non-immediate mental health support, a useful resource is For a Safer Space. For a Safer Space is a nonprofit that offers accessible and inclusive mental health care. Visit the website for more information if you would like to reach out for support. To conclude this video, we will go over some key takeaways. Trauma describes the emotional consequences that distressing events have on an individual. There are 3 types of trauma: acute, chronic, and complex trauma. There are also various examples of traumatic events. However, an important distinction is an event that one person finds traumatic, another person may not. Vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress are often used interchangeably, but have different meanings. As well, these can be experienced by service providers or other individuals who see images or hear stories that are distressing. There are 4 types of trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. There are also 3 elements of trauma: event, experience, and effect. Signs of trauma vary per person. There are 2 classifications of signs, including emotional and psychological signs and physical signs. Trauma impacts the brain by keeping it in a state of hypervigilance so that an individual is in a constant cycle of strong emotional reactivity. Trauma impacts the body as well and can increase the risk of developing various physical health concerns. Trauma and mental health are related. The experience of trauma can result in various mental health concerns. In fact, trauma is directly related to PTSD, but not everyone who experiences trauma will develop PTSD. To continue with this topic, the next video will continue the discussion of trauma. Specifically, trauma as it relates to the pursuit of social justice and trauma-informed care will be covered. That concludes Trauma Part 1. Thank you for watching.